You deserve to know the truth about the woman you've lived with for 45 years. My daughter-in-law said that at my own birthday party, in front of friends, business partners, and my wife. She stood there straight-backed, a glass of wine in her hand, and announced that Beth was not the saint I believed her to be, that she had once stolen another woman's husband, that she was still deceiving me. I looked at my wife. She didn't argue. She didn't defend herself. She just stayed silent. And in that moment, I understood something. This was no longer a birthday celebration. Before I go on, if you've ever had a moment in your family that made your heart feel heavy the way mine did that night, consider subscribing to the channel and leave a comment telling me where you're listening from. I read those messages, every single one. Now, let me tell you exactly how that moment unfolded. Beth didn't argue. She simply set her glass of water down on the table and gently folded her hands together, the same way she used to when she stood in front of a classroom all those years ago. I've watched those hands for 45 years. They stayed up all night grading papers. They folded Jude's tiny shirts when he was a boy. They held mine in the early days, when I was building my career, and we had nothing but a loan and an old apartment that smelled like dust and paint. I didn't speak right away. The laughter that had filled the room only moments earlier disappeared. Outside, Lake Tahoe was still calm beneath the autumn sunset, but inside the living room of that house, the air turned solid. Our guests, old friends, longtime partners avoided my eyes. No one wants to stand in the middle of a family while it slowly exposes its own cracks. Nora stepped forward. Her voice was gentle, almost clinical, like she was sharing a public health notice. She said Beth often visited an old charity foundation, that there was a wealthy man there, someone who had known her when she was young, that those volunteer trips were not what they seemed, that they were private meetings. I heard every word, but what caught my attention wasn't the accusation. It was Jude's face. My son wasn't surprised. He wasn't confused. He stood beside his wife, hands in his pockets, like this was a presentation they had rehearsed. I asked Nora a simple question. "What are you talking about?" She smiled. Polite, controlled. "Everyone knows, Dad." No one just had the courage to say it. I didn't raise my voice. At my age, you don't need volume to create weight. I told her to apologize to my wife. Right there, in front of everyone. Jude stepped in immediately. "Dad, Nora isn't making this up. I've heard it too. You can't protect an unfaithful woman and make things hard for my wife." I don't remember who sighed first. Maybe it was me. In that moment, I didn't feel anger the way young people describe it. I felt something colder. It started in my chest and spread slowly down into my hands. 45 years of marriage, reduced to gossip in the middle of a party. Beth finally spoke. She didn't defend herself. She didn't attack back. She just said softly, "If that's what you believe, I don't know what else to say." Her voice was as gentle as always, and somehow that hurt more than the accusation. I looked around the room. I bought this house 12 years ago, after my construction company sold its final project. I wanted a place where the family could gather during the holidays, a place Jude could bring his wife and children, so we would always feel like a family. Tonight was my 72nd birthday. I ordered good wine. I brought a chef up from Reno to prepare dinner. I invited friends who had witnessed my marriage from the very beginning. I wanted them to see that after all these years, Beth and I were still here, steady, calm. But perhaps, to some people, that kind of steadiness is hard to accept. Nora kept talking. She brought up Beth's past before she met me. She said Beth once worked as a secretary for a married businessman. She suggested the relationship had been inappropriate. Her words were carefully chosen, enough to imply, not enough to sue for defamation. I recognized that tone. I spent 40 years around contracts and clauses. People always know how to stand right at the edge, without stepping over. But the phrase she repeated twice stayed with me. Everyone knows. Who is everyone? The guests here tonight, or just the two of them? I walked over to Beth and placed my hand on her shoulder. She was trembling, not from fear, from hurt. I turned to Jude. "Do you believe this?" He didn't answer right away. He glanced at Nora, as if waiting for permission. Then he said, "I think you should look at things more realistically, Dad. Realistically. I've lived my entire life being realistic. I understand money, assets, reputation, but I also understand trust. And I began to ask myself, why tonight? Why in front of everyone? If they were truly worried about me, they could have spoken privately. If they truly believed it was true, they could have brought proof. But they chose public humiliation. They chose to shame Beth. I smiled, not because I was happy, but because I suddenly saw something clearer than ever before. This wasn't an impulse. It was a test, a calculated move. And if they wanted to turn my birthday into a courtroom, I would not stand there like a defendant. I lifted my glass again. I think I said slowly, we should end the evening here. No one objected. But as the guests quietly gathered their coats and left, I knew one thing. This story wasn't over. It had just begun. And tomorrow morning, I would no longer be the man who stood in silence while his wife was dragged through the mud. That night, when the last door finally closed, and the sound of our guests' cars faded down the slope toward the lake, the house grew strangely quiet. Beth began clearing the unfinished glasses. I told her to leave them. The staff could handle it in the morning. She nodded, but kept folding the table linens anyway. I knew she needed something to steady her hands. We didn't repeat what had been said. 45 years of marriage has taught me that silence isn't always avoidance. Sometimes it's dignity. Before going upstairs, I said only one thing. I believe you. Beth looked at me. There was no gratitude in her eyes, no defensiveness, just exhaustion. And that troubled me more than any explanation would have. I didn't sleep. Close to midnight, I went downstairs for a glass of water. The back glass door was slightly open. From the small garden facing the lake, I heard a familiar voice. Nora. She was laughing. Not the polite laugh from earlier. A relaxed one, unprotected. Tonight went well, she said. He didn't react as strongly as I expected. I stood still behind the wall. I didn't step out. Jude answered, his voice lower. He's always like that. He won't make a scene in front of outsiders. Nora sighed. I just need a few more steps. If people start doubting Beth, it'll be much easier later. Easier for what? Jude asked. But there was no objection in his tone. For easing her out of financial decisions. If she loses credibility, he won't keep putting things in her name. And then she paused. Everything will be simpler. Everything. I heard that word clearly. 10 years ago, I established a family trust. A portion of my assets was placed into it, structured carefully. Beth and I as co-trustees. Jude as primary beneficiary, if we were ever no longer able to manage things ourselves. I built it to protect the family from disputes. It seems transparency can also become a target, Nora continued. He's 72. Sooner or later there'll be a transition. I don't want to wait another 10 years. Jude was quiet for a few seconds. Then he said the sentence that clarified everything. As long as she's not in the way, it'll move faster. In the way, the woman who raised him, who taught him elementary math at the kitchen table, who sold her first ring to help pay his final year of college tuition. Now she was in the way. I didn't step outside. I didn't confront them. I turned back toward the stairs, walking slowly. In my study, I opened the safe. Not to take anything out, just to look at the copies of contracts, the clauses I had signed with the confidence that my family would never need them as a shield. I began reviewing the last 7 years in my mind. Jude's first credit card debt, $150,000 from a short-term investment that failed. I paid it in full on the condition he see a financial advisor. He agreed, but I knew his lifestyle never truly changed. The apartment in San Francisco under my real estate company's name was offered to them temporarily while they stabilized their finances. Temporary stretched into the 4th year. The monthly transfer of $8,000 began when Nora stopped working to have a child. Later, it became their minimum standard of living. Premium health insurance, long-term car lease, a secondary credit card under my account. I once believed that was a father's responsibility. But last night, hearing them discuss removing Beth from financial decisions, I realized that in their eyes, none of it was support. It was entitlement. Around 1 a.m, the glass door closed. Their footsteps came back inside. I turned off the light in my study before they could see it. The next morning, breakfast unfolded as if nothing had happened. Nora asked if I wanted more coffee. Jude talked about a new project at his firm. Beth sat across from me, calm. I wondered if she had heard anything the night before. But I didn't ask. I simply observed. Nora suggested I schedule more frequent medical checkups. At your age, Dad, it's important, she said gently. I nodded. Jude mentioned that we should revisit the trust structure to reflect current circumstances. I nodded again. Perhaps they believed I couldn't hear the rhythm in those proposals. Small steps, small adjustments, all pointing toward reducing Beth's role. I built my career on reading intentions behind words. A contract is never just text. It's a map of power. And last night, I saw that map clearly. When they left at noon to return to California, Nora hugged me and said the previous evening had been a misunderstanding. Jude shook my hand, his confidence untouched, as if everything was proceeding exactly as planned. I stood on the porch and watched their car disappear behind the pines. Lake Tahoe was as still as it had been the night before. I went back inside. Beth was sitting by the window, looking at the water. She didn't ask what I was going to do. She only said, "Don't do anything out of anger." I sat beside her. "I'm not angry," I said. And that was the truth. Anger is temporary. What I felt now was calculation. They hadn't just attacked Beth's dignity. They were preparing for a longer move. If I remained silent, my silence would be interpreted as acceptance. And I have never allowed anyone else to define my family for me. On Monday morning, I will drive to my attorney's office, not to argue, but to rebalance the scale. Monday morning. I left the house at 6. Beth was still asleep. I left a small note on the kitchen table. Meeting my attorney. Back by noon. No explanation. She knows me well enough not to ask. The drive from Lake Tahoe down to Reno is as familiar to me as my own hands. I've taken that road hundreds of times over the years, but that morning every curve felt sharper, as if I were finally heading toward a place I should have gone long ago. My attorney's office sits on the 3rd floor of a low building overlooking the mountains. I've worked with them for more than 20 years, not because I enjoy conflict, but because I believe in structure. Structure holds things upright when emotions begin to sway. Martin looked at me for a long moment after I explained what I wanted. I intend to terminate all financial support to Jude effective immediately, I said, and I want to amend the trust. He didn't ask why. He only asked, "Have you thought this through?" I nodded. We reviewed everything line by line. The San Francisco apartment owned under my real estate company had been provided to Jude and Nora under an internal temporary occupancy agreement. The clause allowed termination with 48 hours' notice. I signed the revocation. The monthly transfer of $8,000 had been structured as voluntary support. I signed the cancellation of the automatic payment. The secondary credit card issued in Nora's name under my personal account closed, effective today. Then the trust. Under its current structure, Jude was the primary beneficiary, should Beth and I become unable to manage it. But while fully competent, I retain the right to amend beneficiaries. I instructed that all beneficiary rights be transferred solely to Beth. If I leave this world first, she will have full authority. Full discretion. Martin watched me as I signed the final page. "I have to ask," he said carefully. "Are you doing this to punish your son?" I took a few seconds. "No," I answered. "I'm doing this to protect my wife." To me, the distinction was clear. When I left the office, the sun was already high. I didn't feel lighter. I felt order had been restored. Around 3 that afternoon, my phone vibrated. Nora. I let it ring twice before answering. Her voice was no longer gentle. My card was declined at the spa. "Is there a problem with the bank?" I looked out at the lake. The water was smooth, untroubled. "There's no problem with the bank," I said. I closed the card. Silence. Then her tone sharpened. "You can't do that without telling me." I just did. "But I need that card. I have appointments." I would think, I interrupted calmly, "that someone as principled as you wouldn't want to use money from a man you believe is tied to something dishonorable." I didn't raise my voice. I simply reflected the spirit of Saturday night. She exhaled sharply. "You're misunderstanding everything." "I don't believe I am." I ended the call. Less than 10 minutes later, Jude called. "Dad, the San Francisco apartment just sent us a 48-hour notice. There must be some mistake." "There isn't. You're overreacting." I leaned back in my chair. "You consider Saturday a small matter." Silence. "I'm not arguing with you," I continued. "I'm adjusting what belongs to me. You're ruining our lives." I looked down at my hands, hands that once poured concrete, hands that signed contracts worth millions. "Your life," I said slowly, should not depend on my account. I hung up. That evening, Beth and I had dinner as usual. She knew something had shifted. She didn't ask for details. But when I told her I had transferred full beneficiary rights of the trust to her, she set down her knife. "You didn't have to do that for me," she said quietly. "I didn't do it for you," I replied. "I did it for principle." She studied me for a long moment, as if searching for what lay beneath that sentence. I didn't elaborate. Around 8 o'clock, the doorbell rang. I had expected it. Jude and Nora stood on the porch. Their confidence from 2 nights earlier, gone. Nora stepped inside without waiting to be invited. "You're going too far," she said. "We only wanted transparency. Transparency doesn't begin with smearing someone," I answered. Jude tried to steady the tone. "If you don't trust us, we can sit down and talk like adults." "I'm speaking like an adult," I said, "and adults understand that actions carry consequences." Nora glanced around the living room. Her eyes paused on the family photographs along the wall. "Are you cutting us off completely?" I didn't answer immediately. There was no image of punishment in my mind, only a boundary. "I'm removing what is no longer grounded in respect," I said. The air in the room grew heavy. Jude's jaw tightened. "Why are you reacting so strongly?" he asked. Over a few words, I looked directly at my son. "No," I said, "because of what I heard afterward." They exchanged a quick glance. Brief, but confirming. I stood. "We won't resolve everything tonight," I said. "But there are truths that need to be placed on the table." And this time, I was no longer the man standing in silence while someone else rewrote my family's story. I didn't invite them to sit. I walked into my study and took a thin folder from the drawer. Not thick, not dramatic, just a few printed pages and a sealed envelope. When I returned to the living room, Jude and Nora were still standing. Beth sat quietly, hands resting on her lap. She didn't look at me, but I knew she was listening to every breath in that room. "I don't like speculation," I said, "so I verify." I placed the folder on the coffee table. Nora's eyes shifted, just slightly, but enough. "On Saturday night," I continued, "when you were talking in the garden, I heard my role in your plan very clearly. I didn't react right away. I wanted to be certain I wasn't misunderstanding." Jude opened his mouth to speak. I raised my hand gently, not to command, just to keep order. I asked an old friend to review a few details. Not because I'm paranoid, but when money and reputation are placed on the same table, I don't allow myself to be careless. I opened the envelope. Inside were copies of messages and hotel reservations sent from Nora's work account to a man whose name I know very well. Jude's direct supervisor. I slid the papers forward. "Perhaps you should take a look." Jude grabbed them first. The color drained from his face. Nora didn't reach for the pages. She only watched me. "Are you spying on me?" she asked, her voice no longer steady. "I'm not spying on anyone," I said. "I review anything that touches my family's assets and reputation." Jude flipped to the last page. His hand trembled. He tried to hide it. He failed. "This doesn't mean anything," Nora said quickly. "It's business. In a private hotel." After hours, I asked evenly. No one answered. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't label it betrayal. I simply laid the truth on the table. "Jude," I said, looking directly at my son for the first time that night, "you defended your wife on Saturday. You said your mother was unfaithful. You said I was protecting the wrong person." Jude looked up. The confidence was gone. In its place, something uncertain, something I had never seen in him. "I take no pleasure in this," I continued, "but you need to understand where you're standing." Nora stepped forward. "Fine," she said, her tone changing completely. No more softness. "Yes, I met him. And do you know why?" She turned to Jude. "Because you need that position. Without me maintaining that relationship, you would have been replaced long ago." The room fell silent. Jude stared at her as if she had spoken a foreign language. "I did everything for us," Nora continued. "What do you have on your own? Other than your father's last name, I didn't interfere." This was no longer a conversation between me and them. Jude let the papers fall back onto the table. "You told me it was just networking," he said quietly. Nora gave a short laugh. "You think networking keeps a seat in that finance firm? I saw it clearly then. What they had built between them wasn't trust. It was leverage. And when leverage feels threatened, it exposes itself. I stepped in before it turned into something uglier." "I'm not interested in the details of your private life," I said. What concerns me is that on Saturday, you chose to smear an innocent woman to advance your own plan. I looked at Nora. You wanted Beth removed from financial decisions. You believed that if her reputation cracked, I would be easier to persuade. Nora didn't deny it. Her eyes no longer hid ambition. So what are you going to do? She asked. I took a slow breath. I'm giving Jude 2 choices. Jude lifted his head. 1. You separate from this marriage. You stand on your own feet. No financial support from me. When you demonstrate that you understand the value of respect, we can talk again. I paused. Or, you stay. And from today forward, you take full responsibility for every decision you make. No apartment, no allowance, no trust. Beth's fingers tightened slightly in her lap. I know she never wanted to see our son in a position like this. But she also knows I cannot do otherwise. Jude looked at Nora. She crossed her arms. You don't need his money, she said quickly. We can handle ourselves. But her voice no longer carried certainty. I looked at my son one last time that night. Your decision, I said, will tell me what you value more, loyalty or advantage. No one spoke after that. Outside, a light wind moved across the lake. I heard the door close as they left. I didn't feel victorious. I felt a chapter had ended. For the first time in days, I turned to Beth. She was still sitting there, quiet, but the hurt from Saturday night was no longer in her eyes, only understanding. No matter what Jude chooses, I did the only thing I could. I put the truth back where it belongs. After the door closed, the house became so quiet that I could hear the ticking of the clock in the dining room. Beth was still sitting there. I poured her a glass of warm water. She took it, but didn't drink right away. You just forced your son to choose, she said softly. I know. And what if he chooses wrong? I looked out at the lake through the large glass window. It was completely dark now, only the lights reflecting faintly on the water. He already chose, I replied. On Saturday night. We didn't mention Jude again that evening, not because it didn't hurt, but because we both understood there are lessons that cannot be taught with advice. They have to be learned through experience. 3 days later, Jude called me. His voice sounded tired. No confidence, no defensiveness. I've moved out, he said. Nora's staying at her friend's apartment. I didn't ask for details. I didn't think things would go this far, he continued. I thought if we applied a little pressure, you would give in. You were wrong, I said. On the other end of the line, I heard him sigh. I'll take care of myself, Jude said. I'm not asking you for support. Good, I replied. You should start there. The call ended briefly. No long apology. No tears. Just a quiet acknowledgement that things had changed. A few weeks later, I was informed that they had officially filed for divorce. I wasn't happy about it. Divorce was never something I wished for my son. But I didn't see it as my failure either. Every adult is responsible for their own choices. As for me, I kept the promise I made to myself. I sold the apartment in San Francisco. The market was favorable at the time. The deal closed faster than expected. Every dollar after taxes, I transferred into a new fund, a scholarship fund in Beth's name. When I told her, Beth shook her head immediately. You don't need to do that. I do, I answered. Not to prove anything, but to put your name where it belongs. Beth spent nearly 40 years standing at a lectern. She believed in education the way I believe in structure and contracts. If anything deserved to carry her name, it wasn't a bank account, it was an opportunity for someone else to begin. The day we signed the paperwork to establish the fund, Beth was silent the entire time. When we left the lawyer's office, she held my hand. You've changed, she said. I just see more clearly, I replied. Jude started a lower-level consulting job at a small firm. I heard about it through an acquaintance in the industry. He rented a modest apartment in the suburbs. No more luxury car. No more expensive dinners. He didn't call often, but occasionally he texted to ask about his mother's health. Beth always replied. I didn't stop her. Cutting off financial support does not mean erasing a blood relationship, but I had drawn a clear boundary, and that boundary was no longer negotiable. Winter came and went. Lake Tahoe changed colors month by month. Some mornings, Beth and I sat on the wooden porch, drinking coffee and watching the lake covered in a thin mist. We began doing the things we had postponed for too long. A drive along the Oregon coast. A week in New Mexico, where Beth had always wanted to visit the small art galleries. Not luxurious trips, just journeys we once delayed because we had to take care of our son. One early spring afternoon, as the sun slowly set behind the mountains, I sat beside Beth on the porch. No phones, no arguments, just the gentle sound of water touching the shore. I held her hand. It took me 45 years to build my career, I said. But it only took one evening to realize that if I lost you, everything else would be meaningless. Beth didn't answer right away. She simply squeezed my hand. I never wanted money, she said, after a moment. I just wanted to be respected. I nodded. That's all I wanted, too. I don't know what Jude's future will look like. Maybe one day he will come back not to ask for money, but to ask for a chance to start over. If that day comes, I will listen. But I will never again confuse patience with weakness. Family is not built with assets. It is built with respect. Money can create dependence, but only honesty can preserve trust. The sun disappeared completely behind the horizon. The last light shimmered across the lake, then slowly faded. I sat there beside the woman who had walked with me for nearly half a century, and for the first time in months, I felt true peace. If my story made you reflect on family respect and the boundaries that must be protected, consider subscribing so you don't miss the next story. A like or a share doesn't just help the channel grow, it helps stories like this reach more people. Thank you for staying until the very end and listening to me. I'll see you in the next story.